When Mara Bennett spent $720 of her last $1,080 on 312 turkey eggs marked for disposal, the man across the road did not call her brave. He called it arithmetic with a death wish. The eggs came from Bourbon Red turkeys, an old American breed with dark chestnut feathers, white-tipped wings, and almost none of the speed commercial growers wanted. They took longer to mature. They needed room. They ate through weeks that fast white turkeys never had to survive. By Monday, the hatchery planned to send every egg to the compost pile. By Saturday evening, every one of them was in Mara's truck. What the town did not understand was that Mara had not bought 312 future Thanksgiving birds. She had bought the last pieces of a clock the poultry business no longer used. At that point, however, she did not know how to make that clock pay. She was 38 years old, widowed, and 3 months behind on the mortgage of a 24-acre farm in the hills of eastern Kentucky. The place had once belonged to her husband's parents. Its barn leaned into the wind. Half the apple orchard had gone wild. The fencing was a patchwork of cattle panels, rusted wire, and hope. Mara lived there with her 10-year-old daughter, Wren. She worked breakfast shift in a school cafeteria, then stocked shelves at a pharmacy 2 nights a week. The money covered food, fuel, and whichever bill had turned the brightest shade of red. It never covered all of them. On the first Sunday of every month, Mara sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. She wrote the mortgage at the top, utilities beneath it, then feed for the 6 laying hens and 1 old milk goat Wren had named Judge. There was never a number left at the bottom. The spring Mara bought the eggs. The bank had already sent a certified letter. The orchard needed pruning. The well pump had begun to shudder. 1 rear tire on her pickup showed a pale strip of cord. Her savings amounted to $1,080.17. That was not investment money. That was survival money wearing a very thin coat. The idea began with a notice taped beside the time clock at the school cafeteria. Ashby Ridge Hatchery closing. Incubators, brooders, breeding equipment, remaining fertile eggs. Mara knew the name. Ashby Ridge had supplied small farms in 3 counties for nearly 60 years. Her late husband had bought their first chicks there when Wren was a baby. The hatchery sat 48 miles away, beyond 2 ridgelines and a river bridge that rattled under heavy trucks. Mara told herself she was going only to look. The place was nearly empty when she arrived. Metal brooders stood unplugged against one wall. Stacks of chick boxes had been flattened for recycling. The familiar smell of warm dust, feed, and feathers had been replaced by cold concrete. The owner, Ernest Ashby, was 74 and moving slowly with one hand braced against a feed cart. He remembered Mara. Ben used to ask more questions than he bought birds, he said. Mara smiled. That sounds like him. Ernest led her to a small storage room. Inside were trays of large cream-colored eggs, some lightly speckled, all dated in pencil. How many? 312. What breed? Bourbon Red. Mara looked through the glass. Why are they still here? Ernest gave a tired shrug. The breeding adults had sold to a private collector. The last eggs were already several days old. Commercial growers did not want them. Local meat buyers wanted birds that reached a standard size on a predictable schedule. These don't, he said. They take their time. What happens Monday? Compost. Mara stared at the trays long enough for Ernest to become uncomfortable. She knew slow birds. Her father had kept heritage turkeys when she was a child. They were rangy, alert, and far better at being turkeys than the broad white birds she saw in supermarket pictures. They could breed naturally. They foraged. They moved through pasture without looking as if their own bodies had betrayed them. But none of that paid a late mortgage. How much for every egg? Ernest turned toward her. Every egg? She nodded. He named $720, including 2 used cabinet incubators that had seen better decades. Then he tried to talk her out of it. The hatch rate could be poor. The incubators might need repairs. Poults were fragile. Heritage birds would consume feed for months before any buyer considered them mature. Mara listened. Then she wrote the check. By the time she reached home, dusk had settled into the hollows. Cal Voss, the neighbor across the road, was closing the doors on one of his contract broiler houses. He raised thousands of fast-growing chickens, under a system he understood down to the pound of feed. He walked over when he saw Mara lifting quilts from the truck bed. "What did you buy? Turkey eggs. What kind?" "Bourbon Reds." Cal stared at her. Then he looked toward the farmhouse, where Wren stood on the porch holding the screen door open. "You spent grocery money on birds the market already replaced." The sentence was not loud. It did not need to be. Mara felt it because it was cruel, and because it was close enough to true. She lifted the first tray. Cal shook his head. "Those birds are built for the slowest clock on the farm." Mara carried the eggs into the barn without answering. The incubators needed more work than Ernest had admitted. One heating coil failed the first night. A fan belt snapped on the second. Mara cleaned years of dust from the vents, replaced wiring, sealed a cracked door, and borrowed a digital thermometer from the agriculture teacher at Wren's school. For 28 days, her world shrank to temperature, humidity, turning trays, cafeteria shifts, pharmacy aisles, and the low mechanical hum behind the barn wall. Wren wrote numbers on masking tape and stuck them to every tray. "What if none hatch?" she asked. Mara checked the thermometer. "Then we will know exactly how much a bad decision cost." Wren considered that. "What if some hatch? Then the bad decision gets more expensive." Wren grinned. "That sounds promising." The first egg pipped at 3:17 on a Thursday morning. By sunrise, the barn was full of faint tapping. Mara sat on an overturned bucket while damp, exhausted poults pushed through their shells. Some never moved. Some began and stopped. A few emerged too weak to stand. By the end of the hatch, 188 poults were alive. 2 weeks later, 173 remained strong. Ernest had expected fewer than 150. Mara should have felt relieved. Instead, she stood in the brooder room calculating how fast 173 small mouths could turn relief into panic. They did it quickly. Starter feed vanished. Bedding stayed dry for approximately 9 minutes at a time. Waterers clogged. Heat lamps burned through electricity. One poult found a gap under a divider. And by the time Wren caught it, 11 others had followed. Mara sold an old utility trailer for $600. 480 of that went into feed, bedding, and a replacement brooder plate. She stopped buying lunch at work. Wren's spring shoes were patched at the toes. The bank sent another letter. By week 7, the birds had feathered into shades of red, copper, cream, and dark brown. They were beautiful. They were also eating like beauty had an invoice. Cal watched them from the roadside one afternoon. About this age. "My birds are almost gone," he said. Mara leaned against the fence. "Mine are just getting interesting. That does not show up on a settlement sheet. No. You have a buyer? Not yet." Cal did not smile. "Then you have feed with legs." He drove away. Mara repeated that phrase all evening. Feed with legs. The next morning, she called the county extension office. She did not ask for a miracle ration. She asked how to stop wasting what she bought and how much of the flock's needs the land could safely support. The agent, Denise Harper, came out with a soil probe, a notebook, and no patience for fantasy. She told Mara the same thing twice. Pasture was not a substitute for balanced feed. Kitchen scraps were not a feeding program. A hungry bird could strip a field faster than a farmer could repair one. But a managed system could reduce waste and create value in more than one place. Mara had an old orchard full of grass, beetles, windfall apples, and fallen branches. She had 2 lower fields that could hold clover, field peas, and millet. She had a manure problem waiting to become compost. She had pumpkins she could sell in autumn, even if the birds never touched them. "Your mistake," Denise said, "would be asking one crop or one animal to save the whole farm." That line changed the way Mara looked at the property. She divided the orchard into small paddocks with portable fencing. She moved the poults before they could turn green ground into bare dirt. She seeded clover and millet. She planted pumpkins near the road and sunflowers along the uphill fence. The birds still received proper feed, but less of it ended up trampled into wet bedding. They ate insects, tender greens, and limited amounts of safe farm produce. Their bedding and manure went into long compost rows. Months later, that compost returned beneath the apple trees and into the pumpkin ground. Nothing worked perfectly. One field washed after 3 days of hard rain. Deer ate the tops from half the sunflowers. A batch of compost went sour because Mara made it too wet. The turkeys discovered that portable fencing was a suggestion unless the charger was working. But the farm began to behave like a system instead of a collection of emergencies. What the birds left behind fed the soil. What the soil produced reduced waste around the birds. The pumpkins paid for fencing. The orchard gave the birds space, shade, and something no commercial barn could provide: time. Time was also the problem. By late summer, Mara had burned through the money from the trailer sale. Feed prices had climbed again. The mortgage was 96 days overdue. Then the processor she had counted on called. His equipment was set for uniform commercial birds. Mara's turkeys were too varied in size, and her numbers were too small to make a special run worthwhile. He canceled. The bank gave her 21 days to bring the loan current. Mara called a livestock dealer in Tennessee. He offered $6 per bird if she delivered the entire flock. $6. After months of feed, repairs, fencing, and labor, the flock was worth less to him than 1 week of keeping it alive. Mara asked for one night to decide. That evening, she walked the orchard with a flashlight and tried to choose what failure would look like. Sell the birds and lose the farm more slowly. Keep the birds and risk losing it all at once. A large tom followed her between the trees. He had a deep red body, white-tipped tail, and a blue-white head that changed color when he became alert. Wren had named him Copper. Mara stopped beneath an old winesap apple tree. Copper stopped too. "You are terrible at being a cheap turkey," she told him. 2 days later, Wren came home with a permission form for the county heritage fair. Her class had been assigned one piece of local agricultural history. Most students planned poster boards. Wren wanted to bring Copper. Mara almost laughed. Then she looked at the dealer's $6 offer lying beside the bank letter. If the flock was worth more alive, she needed proof from people who had never seen it. She agreed to bring 1 tom and 2 hens. The fair was held behind the county museum on a Saturday morning. Antique engines popped and rattled near the entrance. Quilters worked beneath a long tent. A blacksmith drew a steady ring of sparks. Mara set the 3 turkeys inside a clean portable pen beside Wren's handwritten sign. Bourbon Red turkey, slow growing, naturally breeding, almost replaced by faster birds. At first, Mara stood behind the pen wishing she had stayed home. Then Copper spread his white-tipped tail. A line formed. Children wanted to know why his head changed color. Older farmers remembered birds their grandparents had kept. Parents asked whether the breed was gentle, whether it could forage, and why anyone had stopped raising something so striking. For 3 hours, Mara answered questions that no processor had ever asked. Near closing time, a woman named Lila Grant waited until the crowd thinned. She managed Briar House, a restored inn that hosted autumn weekends, school history programs, and small weddings. She had spent 20 minutes watching guests abandon the antique carriage display to stand near Copper. "Would you sell a trio for our heritage garden?" she asked. Mara almost answered with the dealer's number, $6 per bird. Instead, she asked what the inn actually needed: calm birds, healthy legs, good feathering. Birds accustomed to people. A breed with a story guests would remember. Not one requirement involved processing weight. Mara named a price of $180 for a tom and 2 hens. There was a pause long enough for her to regret every syllable. Lila said, "I expected more." Mara did not lower the price. 3 days later, Lila arrived at the farm with crates and cash. The livestock dealer had offered $18 for those same 3 birds. Briarhouse paid $180. That sale did not rescue the farm. It did something more important first. It proved the birds were not worthless. They were being priced by the wrong job. The fair organizer asked Mara to return the next month for a school program. Briarhouse ordered another trio before Thanksgiving. A homestead family wanted naturally breeding stock. A heritage breeder in Ohio asked whether Mara could ship fertile eggs the following spring. The questions were different now. People asked about temperament, parentage, fertility, foraging behavior, leg strength, feather pattern, and whether the birds could live safely around visitors. No one asked how cheaply Mara could turn them into pounds. She started keeping records. Every hatch, every health issue, every breeding group, every bird sold. She removed aggressive toms from the breeding program. She would not sell a bird that moved poorly, carried a visible weakness, or panicked around routine handling. She also told buyers the inconvenient parts. Bourbon Reds needed time. They needed secure shelter, good fencing, proper nutrition, and protection from weather and predators. They could damage gardens. Toms could become territorial. A beautiful bird was still livestock, not a lawn ornament. Some buyers disappeared after that conversation. Mara considered that a success. The people who stayed understood what they were buying. By the next spring, she had a waiting list for poults and fertile eggs. Then came the offer that could have ruined everything. A regional attraction wanted 60 turkeys for multiple fall sites. The payment would have caught up the mortgage in 1 season. Mara walked through the barn with the contract in her hand. To fill it, she would need more breeding birds, more brooder space, more feed, more labor, and less room for mistakes. The orchard would take more pressure. The birds would become units again. Cal heard about the offer. "You finally found volume," he said. Mara looked toward the upper field, where Copper's offspring moved through clover. "No," she said. "Volume found me. And I am not sure it belongs here." Cal stared at her as if she had failed a second intelligence test. Mara turned down the contract. She accepted 12 birds for 1 site instead. That decision slowed the money. It protected the mechanism that had created the money. She expanded by systems, not by appetite. 1 new brooder only after the previous one was paid for. 1 new paddock only after the grass rotation worked. 1 additional fall weekend only after Wren and the part-time help could manage visitors without neglecting the flock. The farm's income spread into small streams. Fertile eggs, poults, breeding trios, pumpkins, apples, sunflower seed, composted litter for local gardeners, school tours, autumn photography sessions. Workshops for families who wanted to raise heritage poultry without pretending the work was easy. No single stream was large enough to save the farm. Together, they stopped the farm from needing to be saved by one thing. 4 years after the liquidation sale, Mara was current on the mortgage. In year 5, she replaced the well pump without borrowing money. In year 6, no single part of the business produced more than 1/3 of the farm's income. A failed pumpkin crop hurt, but it did not end the year. A weak hatch reduced poultry sales, but the orchard weekends carried the gap. The slow birds had forced Mara to build a farm that did not depend on speed. Wren grew tall enough to carry 2 feed buckets at once. She designed the farm's signs, ran the reservation list, and could explain the difference between a commercial hybrid and a naturally breeding heritage turkey before most visitors finished parking. Cal continued raising contract poultry across the road. He never converted his barns. He never pretended Mara's system would work for his, and Mara never claimed his numbers were foolish. Commercial farms served a market that demanded uniformity, volume, and speed. Her birds could not win that race. The difference was that she had stopped entering them. 8 years after Mara unloaded 312 eggs, the farm looked repaired rather than transformed. The barn still leaned a little. The stone walls were still uneven. The orchard still dropped more apples than anyone could sell. But the roof did not leak. The fences held. The mortgage statement no longer arrived like a threat. Mara kept 46 breeding birds and closed the waiting list whenever demand pushed beyond what the land could support. On busy October weekends, families followed a trail through the orchard to watch red turkeys move beneath yellow leaves. Children learned how bedding became compost, how compost fed pumpkins, and why a bird could be valuable for reasons a processing chart never measured. Inside the farm workshop, Wren framed 2 pieces of paper side by side. On the left was the livestock dealer's offer, $6 per bird. On the right was the receipt from Briar House, 1 breeding trio, $180. Between them, she placed the first hatch sheet with 312 written across the top and 188 circled beneath it. No slogan, no explanation. The papers explained each other. One October evening, after the last visitors had gone, Cal crossed the road and stood in the workshop doorway. He studied the 2 prices. "I was right about the feed," he said. "Yes, and the time. Yes, and they still make no sense in my barns." Mara looked through the open door at the red birds moving beneath the apple trees. "They were never supposed to make sense in your barns." Cal nodded slowly. For the first time, the difference between them did not feel like an argument. It felt like 2 honest answers to 2 different questions. Mara never made the turkeys grow faster. She never discovered free feed. She never turned 24 acres into an empire. She learned the land well enough to connect what already belonged there. The birds gave the orchard movement, manure, and a story. The orchard gave the birds forage, shade, and time. The visitors paid for the chance to see a farm where those pieces still touched. And the farm gave Mara and Wren something no liquidation sale had offered them, a future built on terms they could actually keep. The birds never learned to race. Mara built a life that no longer required them to.